Welcome, everyone, this evening to this presentation by the St. Joseph's College Center for Faith and Spirituality. And I'm happy to have as my guest this evening Bishop Robert Deeley, who is the Bishop of Portland, Maine. And I'm going to have a conversation with the Bishop about the legacy of Pope Benedict XVI, his impact, his legacy, actually, on the Church as a theologian, Pope, priest, bishop, the many different roles that he served in the Church. So I want to begin first by welcoming Bishop Deeley. Thank you, Bishop Deeley, for joining us this evening. We're happy to have you with us.
It's my pleasure, Chris. I'm happy to be here.
So I wanted to start because you have a very unique perspective here, because your perspective isn't just as one, a leader in the Church, a bishop, relating to another bishop or a pope. You actually worked with Pope Benedict when he was Cardinal Ratzinger for the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith. And I want to start with the impressions that sometimes that circulated in the public or in the media versus the actual person. So I think you can start us here with a very good perspective. That is, sometimes you will read in the media titles applied to him when he was the head of the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith of, the Vatican's bulldog or the enforcer. Yet when I have read about personal accounts of people who worked with him and for him, they're very different. So can we start there? What are the misimpressions that have been communicated about Pope Benedict, and what did you see in working with him? What do we not know, perhaps, if we relied solely on the media to tell us about him?
Thanks, Chris. I really am happy to be here. This was one of the most wonderful experiences in my life to have the opportunity to work with Cardinal Ratzinger before he was elected Pope Benedict. In 2004, I was asked to go to Rome to work in the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith at the request of the American bishops. I was really a drop-in that was a canon lawyer, and they needed some help, and the American bishops sent over two priests to kind of get dropped into the congregation to help with all the backlog of cases concerning sexual abuse perpetrated by clerics. And my assignment was for 18 months. I was supposed to go over a year to 18 months to try to work on these cases. From the very beginning, I had heard the stories about the Panzer Cardinal and all of these kind of things, and Bulldog and all these things. From the very beginning, I found him to be a very kind man. Probably a good example of that is I went over in September, and the Cardinal is a very shy man, very much a person of a regular schedule, and so he would come in after everything got started in the morning, and I happened to be downstairs one morning. It was around just before Christmas, and I was just there a couple of months, and he stopped me and said, "Monsignor Deeley, why are you still here?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Shouldn't you be home for Christmas? Shouldn't you be in your parish and with your family for Christmas?" He paid attention to what was going on around him. He was a very shy man, and so consequently, he wasn't into small talk, but he loved to listen to it, and he loved to be present in conversations, and he loved the world about him. One of the things that intrigued him, I went over in 2004. It was in the midst of a presidential election, when we would gather as a staff on Friday mornings for coffee. He would engage the three of us who were Americans who were there. One was working full-time, and then the two of us part-time, in a conversation about the American election. He was fascinated by how it worked and all the rest of this. So he was a very, very interesting man, interested in what was going on around him, and interested in the people who worked with him. The people who worked with him were fiercely loyal to him. There were people in the congregation who fit the image of being mean and nasty. I must say that, but they were not. They were not Cardinal Ratzinger, and I had experience with one of them when I was president of the Canon Law Society of America, and I went to Rome to make a visit, and one of the officials of the Congregation of Doctrine of the Faith came out to meet us and immediately started to basically berate us about a publication which he didn't like. And we had to, when he stopped to take a breath, we informed him, we don't publish that document. Therefore, he had to back off. But I mean, there wasn't such a reputation. But I think it's important, if you listen to the bishops who saw him on the ad limina visits, they saw a man who was keenly interested in what it was that they were talking about. He really initiated the model of ad limina visits, which Pope Francis is now doing. Pope Francis has informed the different dicasteries that they're there to listen and to support the bishops in their work. And so he's changed the whole tone of those ad limina visits. He wants the Holy See to react to the thing, to find out how they can be helpful to the bishops. That's what Cardinal Ratzinger did. If you talk to the bishops who would go to those meetings, they would say the best meeting they had when they were in Rome was the meeting with Cardinal Ratzinger. He would not start with a prepared statement. He would immediately begin by listening to the needs of the particular group of bishops who had come to see him, having reviewed the documents that they had sent ahead of time. And he would start with those questions, and he would generate a discussion, and then he would help them to come to some conclusions about how they might deal with things. That's the kind of person he was. He was a very kind man, and shy, and therefore, could be perceived as aloof, but that was not really the case in my book. I was there again, and I went home for Christmas, and I came back. They had asked me, because I had been president of the Canon Law Society, to make a list of those canonists who might be able to come and work in the Vatican, because they needed some more help other than temporary help. And when I came back from Christmas, having presented that list to them beforehand, I was informed that the Cardinal wanted to know why my name wasn't on the list. And I said, well, I'm too old, because I was. The Vatican, you have to get hired by the time you're about 40 years old. I was already 45 years old or something. So he said, well, I can change that. So then I ended up staying for 7 years. So I had an ample opportunity to get to know him and to see the way in which he worked and the thinking of his mind. So it was a very valuable experience and a very rich one.
He's also, it's hard to, I think, overstate his importance as a theologian in the church. Someone who was part of the Second Vatican Council, but also a theology professor, an academic, an intellect. And when I read his work, I see someone with a very deep curiosity about the world and about being a Christian in the world. How would you describe him as a theologian and as a bishop whose responsibility is as part of the magisterium of the church? How did his theology, or did his theology in any way, help inform your work as bishop?
Oh, I think so, because his theology was started in prayer. He, in his last will and testament, he says, he gives what I think is the key to understanding who he is and who he became in his life. Jesus Christ is truly the way, the truth, and the life. And the church, in all her shortcomings, is truly his body. Now that is about as realistic a notion of and call to theology as anything I've heard. His last words, according to Archbishop Ganswein, were, "Lord, I love you." His whole life was dedicated to deepening within himself and those that he taught through his writings, through his homilies, through his letters, through his speeches, through all of that. a love of the Lord and how that plays itself out in life. Indeed, he was a great, great theologian and a pivotal figure in the history of the church. I mean, at 35 years old, he was a praetor at the Second Vatican Council and drew up some of the important, not necessarily the documents, but the speeches that were pivotal in moving the direction of the council away from the Ottaviani pre-prescribed 30 days and we're out of here approach to how the council was going to be run to something which was much more dynamic and gives us the beautiful documents, Church in the Modern World, and these kinds of things that we have, the liturgy document, the beautiful liturgy document, and all of those, and eventually leading, of course, to religious freedom, and those kinds of things. He had a deep sense of the need for the church to move in a new direction, and and yet he saw it, as he continued to say, from 1968 on, that the council was a continuation. The teaching of the council was a continuation of the teaching of the church. It was not a rupture; it was a continuation, and that was his. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we have the two Communio and Concilium, those two publications, and that's what he saw as his goal and as his thing, and why ultimately he accepted the position of being in charge of the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith. If he was what his reputation could be seen as, he would have eagerly accepted that position. It took John Paul 3 or 4 times to convince him to go to Rome. He wanted to be a professor. He wanted to teach. Now he was already an archbishop. He had accepted that in obedience, and then, but it was only when St. John Paul II moved the question for him to obedience that he accepted the position of being prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And so I think his theology is pivotal. And living as long as he did, of course, he was the last of those people who were so instrumental in forming the beautiful teaching, which is the council.
Each pope, I think, builds both on the legacy of his predecessors while also establishing perhaps his own distinct legacy. How would you describe Benedict's legacy, both in relation to his predecessors, but also what he contributed to the church as pope?
I think that, though he was a theologian, I would have known him as a canon lawyer. I mean, not that he was a canon lawyer, because he would never say that he was. But the fact of the matter is that he recognized in his responsibility in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith the importance of discipline and life, and therefore law, in relation to how the church was going to be organized. When in 2001, before the crisis of clergy sexual abuse had really exploded in the United States, he had already been convinced by his own observation that the only way in which the sex abuse thing was going to be dealt with decisively was to bring it under the aegis of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Because the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith has the ability to have its own trials, it has the section on discipline, it has the section on doctrine, and it has a section on marriage. And the discipline section deals with what are called the more grave delicts or crimes in the church, in the life of the church. So those deal with things which truly affect. The reason they're in the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith is they really affect the things that really affect the faith of the church. So a violation of the seal of confession is a bruise, is a wound to the faith of the church, and the misuse of the sacraments is an abuse of faith, because it undermines people's belief system and the way in which they come to God and the way in which they encountered Christ. So he wanted that to be in the Congregation of Doctrine and Faith. There wasn't a lot of talk about this in Rome because the belief in Rome was that this was an Anglo problem. This was a problem in the United States and Ireland and Australia. It somehow was in the genes of the English-speaking world, but it was not in the rest of the world. They simply didn't see it as there. But he understood that it was going to be a problem, and so in 2001, he convinced St. John Paul II that it belonged in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And then he gathered together some people to make it possible. So in 2002, when the crisis broke in the United States, and people from the first review board that we had in the United States went and met with him, and he sat and he talked with them. From that point on, he was convinced of the seriousness of the crisis and the need to deal with it as decisively as possible. And he was reliably doing that until he was no longer the Pope. He was continuing to against great opposition from within some of the people in the Holy See who didn't believe this was a worldwide problem. And he saw to it that it was centralized in the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, and that it was treated as a serious offense. And he affirmed the American Bishops' Dallas Charter, which affirmed one strike and you're out, and all of those kinds of things. He was truly instrumental and important in that, and he doesn't get enough credit for that. In 2010, there was a whole controversy around some decisions that he made in the 60s when he was Archbishop of Munich, at a time when historically this was not an issue of the same seriousness that it began to be seen as we understood it better and better, and got away from psychologizing it and began to see it for the crime that it was and the delict that it was. So I think that I think that's very important for his legacy, that he did what he was able to do with the insight that he had to do that. And I think that those steps that he took are extremely important to the way in which they made it possible for the faith to be lived, because abuse is destructive of faith.
It seems to me that that gets to another misunderstanding of about him and Francis, that somehow nothing was being done until Francis came along as Pope, when in fact quite a bit was being done by Benedict in terms of trying to address this problem and be serious about this problem.
The document Sacramentorum Sanctitatis Tutela was 2001, which is long before Pope Francis. That was revised, and a second edition of that came out while I was working in the congregation. It was called Essential Norms, and or Norms, and the Essential Norms in the United States. Norms was this document, 2010, which revised that. It changed the dates concerning pornography. It changed. It included other things in those. It was a revision of the document on the more grave delicts. These things were all done before Pope Francis was elected. The essential norms and which are particular law for the United States, which govern, which enshrined in our practice here in the United States, the one strike you're out policy was affirmed by the Holy See as law in 2005, if I'm not mistaken, through the advocacy of Cardinal Ratzinger. He was not himself Pope at the time, but he advised, he saw John Paul twice a week. He had lunch with him once a week, and he had a meeting with him every Friday afternoon. He brought over the documents that he needed to bring to his attention, but he would have lunch with him. He was an extremely important advisor to John Paul II. in terms of all of these kinds of things.
The other, as Pope, it's also, I think, important to remember that Benedict issued several encyclicals, some very important encyclicals. And for me, when I was teaching theology more regularly, the one that really always struck me was Caritas in Veritate. I find it such an interesting social encyclical. In particular, I was struck that I think it was the first social encyclical I had ever read that actually addressed the issue of travel, that how we travel can be an act of justice, in terms of the decisions we make, where we go. So could you address a little bit about the encyclicals of Benedict, your impression of them, their importance, what they've contributed to Catholic teaching?
You see, I think that once again, if we go back to what I said earlier, that Jesus is the center of everything that he does. I think the other two, Caritas in Veritate and Spe Salvi, give us a real view of Christian life, and Caritas in Veritate, of course, talks in a very deep way about love and marriage, and the centrality of love as a reality in the church. It's a beautiful thing, and then of course the whole reflection on hope in Spe Salvi is a wonderful faith-filled document, and a beautiful testament to the virtue of hope. So I think those are really important in the life of the church.
And of course, he made the almost unprecedented decision to resign. Pope had resigned in 5 centuries before he did. And could you talk a little bit about that? What can we learn from that decision to step down from what is arguably the most powerful position, perhaps, in the world?
One of the I was interested in what Pope Francis recently said, that he didn't think it was a good thing to resign. I find that interesting because he supported the resignation all during the 9 years since or 8 years since, well, it'll be 10 now, I guess, that since Pope Benedict resigned. But he's saying now that he doesn't necessarily think it's a good idea. And I've thought about that because I think we've seen it, and perhaps it was necessary for it to happen, so it would not be a one-off in history, and that it would be. But I think we now have to ask ourselves the questions: is it a good thing? And I think in the case of Benedict, I think we have to look at the context within which that happened. If you go back and you read his, I can't remember now the title, it's one of those moments, the title of his book on his life history before, from when he was a child. His family was extremely important to him. I mean, in that culture in which he grew, even though we might tend to think in the United States of the Nazi purge and all of that as a matter that took place during World War II, it really began 8 or 9 years before that, when Joseph Ratzinger was a child, and so that. And his family obviously was not going to subscribe to the Hitler doctrine. And so consequently, in my mind, they became totally dependent on each other. That was where they drew their strength. Ratzinger was very close to his brother, Georg, and his family was so close that his sister lived with him in Rome. She took care of his apartment and took care of his everyday life for years when he went to Rome. So she had died, I think, around 2000 or something like that. And so he continued to regularly communicate with his brother, and then his brother was a few years older than him. And then by 2008, was already starting to fail because he died a few years after that. I think that makes a difference in um, because he was a shy man and he depended on his family and he reached a point in his life where his family was no longer present to him and he was overwhelmed by what was happening to him. Now we've learned that he was having difficulty sleeping and therefore he was being medicated for that and was not he just didn't he was losing his touch with reality in his mind. This is a man of a very clear mind and clear thinking, and it just became overwhelming for him. I often talk to the seminarians that the decisions that they're making are not necessarily their own. They're in a church, they're in a community, and they have to share what their concerns are with me or with the people around them who are there to help them because this is a community thing. And I think that I wonder how much, I mean, he didn't tell anyone of what his decision was. Uh, and so that's one piece of the thing. The other piece of the thing is, of that decision, is the terrible way in which John Paul II died. Um, I think it's historical fact that 35 appointments of bishops were made in the 24 hours before he died. He was not conscious. He was not in any way making those decisions. And even though uh, Pope Benedict Cardinal Ratzinger was the Camerlengo and should have been uh, present, he was not present in the room uh, when he was certainly not there through those last days of sickness. Whether or not they brought him in at the very end, I can't remember. But he really was not present during that time. They did not. They did not bring him into the room. So but he had experienced that, and he knew that from his own dealings with Pope John, that he saw him, John Paul, he saw him failing and decisions being made around him. And I think he was afraid of what was happening to him. He didn't know what to do. He did not have the best advisors at that point in his papacy. And I think he was just overwhelmed. And uh, so he chose to do that. Personal story, in October of 2012, I was in Rome. I had come home in July of 2011 to work in the Archdiocese in Boston for Cardinal Sean. And uh, I had not had a chance, because it was July, that when I left, to have a farewell meeting with the Pope, which is part of what would have happened. So I went on retreat in Assisi in October of 2012, and I asked Cardinal Harvey, who was the head of the papal household, if I could have that meeting now. And he said, "Yeah, you come to the audience, and I'll make sure you get introduced." And so I said, "Well, that's fine. He'll know me." And I saw him that day, and I said to Cardinal Harvey afterwards, I said, "There's something seriously wrong." I said, "It looks like he's had a stroke. He can't see out of one eye. He's only looking out of one eye. He doesn't seem to know whether it's Tuesday or Friday, and I'm concerned." "Oh no, he's fine. He's fine." But he was very much weakened. And the next year, I went back because I was made a bishop shortly thereafter, and uh, uh, and I went back for the bishops' workshop and went to visit. It was my last visit with then Pope Benedict, and he was wonderful. The conversation was animated. I went with Archbishop Scicluna, who's the Archbishop of Malta now. We were both named bishops at pretty much the same time, and we went together to see him. And he was talking about Boston and he was recalling stories that had happened when we were in the office together. I mean, he was as clear and lucid as a bell. He was right there. So I knew that the weight of the office had really taken its toll on him. And so I think that those are all things. Now, in the end, is it a good thing? I think there is something uh, lost in the I think it was a dangerous period of time when we had two popes, and I think that I think it was only because of the strength and the dignity and the commitment of both of those men to the good of the church that there was not the train didn't go off the tracks. And so I think that I think that it is distinctly possible that Pope Francis has rethought this and realizes that it's probably not a good thing to resign. But it was at the time, it was, it was earthbreaking, and it was
Yeah,
incredible.
yeah, that's interesting. I have some other questions, but at this point, I'm going to open up to anyone who's with us who might like to ask a question of the bishop. So if you'd like to do that, again, use the raise hand feature or throw a question in the chat, and please ask your question of the bishop. So is there anyone who'd like to ask a question of Bishop Deeley? Yes, Tyler.
Hi, Bishop. I'm relatively new Catholic, so I'm really appreciate getting to see you here. I'm a Mainer myself. Um, Reading Pope Benedict's work, he's written a lot about the dictatorship of relativism, and that just seems to be like the thing that's going on right now in the church, or not. I'm sorry, not the church, the culture. There is no good, there is no bad. There is nothing real, and clearly the church stands athwart that. Um, it's a strange time to be a Catholic. Uh, do you have any? Could you speak to this aspect of Pope Benedict's work, and do you have any thoughts for the lay people? And thank you.
Tyler, I welcome to the church, and I think you have you have spoken against relativism by becoming a member of the church, and so you speak to the power of the gospel and the power of the community to speak a message to you, which says, "Come and join us and be what we are, and listen to this good news that we have, which tells us of our eternal worth in Jesus Christ and our eternal life, and the love that asks us to show to one another." Uh, I think you're right. I was at the University of Maine last night for Mass and a conversation with the students, and I go up a couple times a year for that. And uh, the kinds of realities that they live in uh, are breathtakingly difficult. They they are living in a campus, where those relativistic values are challenged every day, and so I greatly admire the students for their willingness to continue to practice their faith, to continue to draw strength from the Eucharist, because that's not only practicing faith; it's really finding that in that Eucharist is our strength. And if anything that Pope Benedict taught us, I mean, his Eucharistic theology is Sacramentum Caritatis, and his different works really tells us very definitely that Jesus is the center of our lives, and we find the meaning of our lives there, and that requires us to. I mean, nature is a creation of God. He writes. I can't remember where he gets started on his. He really invents the human ecology. I mean, it's him that we go to for the human ecology. That 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 the human being is at the center of 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 ecology, and we start by respecting life, and then we move towards respecting the earth. From our understanding of the creation of life, then we can understand the importance of caring for nature. But it's always within the context that nature is reasonable. I mean, remember, Ratzinger's books on faith and reason um, and those kinds of things just emphasize for us that faith and reason are not contradictory to each other, but are are, cooperate with each other. I was at the seminary in Boston last week talking to our seminarians, and we were talking about this because we have a number of seminarians. We have a couple of seminarians who are graduates of the university, and they were science students, and they are now studying the philosophy of science and the philosophy of nature, if you will. And so and I asked them how it was going. They said, well, it's a little different perspective than the perspective that I got at the university. And it is because we ultimately find out that science is able to be done because it's able to know the order that there is in nature, which gives you a clue. There is an order in nature, and at the head of it is the creator. And that's now you can only, reason will only bring you so far, but it isn't contradictory to faith to say that the creator is at the head of the whole thing, because reason brings you to an order, and the order brings you to the creator. The faith brings you to the creator. So I think that it's a great question, and it's going to be one that you are going to live out. Uh, but you think about it and reflect on it in prayer that you have encountered Jesus Christ through the community, which you found something in that community that you wanted to be part of. And so the message continues to do its graceful act on us. And I'm grateful for your question.
Thank you, Bishop. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Tyler. Anyone else like to ask a question of the bishop? Raise your hand, please. Yes, Greg.
Thanks, Bishop Deeley. I really appreciated the insight to Pope Benedict, because it's obviously what we see was only mostly through the media, and I don't think some of it was exactly accurate, to say the least. But there was a movie out a little while ago. I think it was a Netflix deal, which it was called The Two Popes, which actually was I thought was very flattering of both men. But I was just curious of did they have that kind of close relationship going forward? And really was Pope Benedict, was he the one that kind of sounded like he talked Francis into making sure that he took the job on, I guess, as it were? So just curious your thoughts on that.
I don't think so. I didn't see the movie, but I don't. First of all, Cardinal Ratzinger was not at the election of the new pope. He wasn't there at all. He was, and the decision is made in the Sistine Chapel. He accepts when he's elected. So if there was no possibility of a conversation. Pope Benedict, if you remember, on that day that he resigned, which I think was February 28th, 2013, the famous helicopter ride took him up to Castel Gandolfo. That was the night of February 28th, and he was gone. He didn't come back down into the Vatican until after the election. He remained in Castel Gandolfo because he didn't want to interfere. He didn't want to get involved, and he didn't want to. So I can't see where there would have been a conversation. Were they close? I think I know that Francis would go visit him on a sporadic basis for the holidays and so on, and he was always very respectful to him. But they certainly didn't think the same way, and so I think they found a way to do things together. I think the other piece of the resignation of Pope Benedict is we also know now that he thought all of these illnesses were these things that were happening to him indicated that his life was over, and he didn't want to be an invalid and have the things happen to him that happened to John Paul II. And so he didn't think he would live for a year afterwards. He thought it was over. And the fact that he lived for almost 10 years was as incredible to him as it was to everyone else. So he didn't expect to live that long because he really thought these conditions were going to kill him. And he was already 86. So, he figured, well, that's going to be it. So I think that's the other piece of it. But I can't say that I know one way or the other whether or not they were. I was out of Rome in 2011, so I would go back. I've had responsibilities over there and have been back a number of times. But the last visit I made to him was 2013 because it was such a rich, grace-filled afternoon that I didn't think it could be topped, and I didn't want to disturb him anymore. He was a man who was retired. I loved him. I appreciated what he had done for the church, and I told him that, and felt that I wasn't going to bother him any further.
Thanks.
Thanks, Craig. Bishop, you mentioned both the Pope's writing about human ecology, and he writes about it in Caritas in Veritate. And we're talking about Francis. And yes, clearly there's a different style to each of them as Pope. But do you think that the differences get overplayed to the point of the media positioning as in opposition over against each other? Because when I read Caritas in Veritate, as you mentioned, he writes about creation, he writes about a human ecology, and I see Francis in Laudato Si building on that, carrying it forward, not writing a brand new, as if the church never talked about creation before. But in fact, you see a progression from Paul VI to John Paul II to, I think, a real deepening with Benedict, and then Francis building on that. So while they were different, do you think that the difference gets overplayed to the point of one being over against the other?
Well, in terms of the press, I think it's important to note that when the liberal press, like the New York Times, hears Pope Francis say something they like, they publish it. When they hear something they don't like, they don't publish it. I mean, it's as simple as that. And that's been consistently an issue. And then they sometimes, when he does come out with a statement which can be taken either way, they will try to put those words in which are going to emphasize what they want. And it's always convenient for the press to have a yin yang, to have the opposition. They like that. So Benedict was always, because he was, I would characterize him, though I don't like to characterize a man of his the breadth of his intelligence as conservative, but he would probably be a more conservative person than Pope Francis on this. It's a different culture. I mean, he comes from a whole different culture and worldview than Pope Francis. So it's not. I think that's one of the struggles for us, even myself, is to understand Francis. We'd have to understand South America and Argentina, and we don't. It's not necessarily. It's easy for me to understand Ratzinger because we're kind of steeped in a European culture. That's the education system that we have. Pope Francis thinks like an Argentinian. That's what he is, and that's a different worldview. It's a different way of looking at things.
Anyone else? A question for the bishop? Yes, Heidi.
Hi, Bishop. I'm a Catholic school principal, and based on education in the United States, I would like to ask that, based on your insight and all of your experiences, what would you like to tell Catholic school administrators as a way to strengthen our schools today amongst all the challenges that we face?
I would tell you to go to Mass on Sunday. And
Okay.
to listen and to draw closer to the Lord Jesus. And as such, I think that you will come to understand the world in which we live in a different way. And that will, because when we draw close to the Lord, he draws close to our hearts. And he conveys to us the love that he has for us, that God has for us. And that, of course, is what the teachers then will bring to the students. And they will, we get caught up in differences of opinion and so on and so forth. So I say cut away from all the differences of opinion and go to church. I would love to see every one of my Catholic school teachers at Mass every Sunday. deepening their relationship with the Lord so that they can bring that love to the students in their classrooms. That, I think, is the essence of what it means to be in a Catholic school. And we get ourselves apart from it when we don't have Jesus at the center of who we are and what we do, and allow him to be the teacher, because he will do it. That's his title, the divine teacher. I that may not be what you expected, but I think that's what I think would be important.
No, I think that's beautiful. Thank you very much.
Anyone else? I know we have at least one theologian and one philosopher here with us this evening. I don't know if either one of them might have a question for the bishop.
No canon lawyers?
Not canon lawyers. Yes, Lisa.
Good evening, Bishop. Thank you so much for being with us. One of the things that I have a tremendous appreciation for regarding Pope Benedict is from the very earliest years of his being a theologian, he seemed to have such a pulse on the world and where it was going in regards to secularization. Obviously, John the 23rd did as well, hence why he was calling Vatican II. But the whole God question that Cardinal Ratzinger / Pope Benedict put forth for the new evangelization, I think has just shaped the way in which now we're looking at how do we communicate the truth and the richness of the faith. How did you see that played out in his work among the doctrine of faith?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I was just reading something and getting ready for today that over the last week or so. He first said, remember, one of the things that is important about what he said was he said that the church is going to be smaller and it will become a smaller entity, and then from that, because it is the church and Jesus has promised that he will be with it all for all time, it will grow again. And he said that in 1968, in the midst of all the difficulties and the explosions. That was the year I graduated from college, and I was in Europe shortly thereafter for seminary in Rome, and all these demonstrations and all of those kinds of things were going on in Paris and in Europe. I mean, that was the beginning of the cultural conflagrations, which have continued since then in one way or another. So I think that he did his theology in that mood, and it marks a change in his own life, because the earlier notion of progress, that somehow we were making this progress and we were getting an original sin wasn't invented again in each and every individual person, and all of us constantly have to overcome the sin in our own lives and know the mercy of God. I think that that would be representative of his theology. He would make shifts in his own theology as a result of the conflagrations of the late 60s in Europe, and that affects the way he thinks about the church, and he brings us back to the basics in that regard. So I think that's what we continue to do.
Thank you very much.
Jake.
Hi, Jake Thibault, Philosophy Department at St. Joseph's. I found it so interesting that Pope Benedict took the name Benedict. This idea of, we often think of John Paul II as part of the new evangelization, but it seems like Pope Benedict was also key on the idea of re-evangelization, especially of the West. Do you have any recommendations or Benedict flavor of evangelization that could work with the youth, particularly college-age students? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I do. I mean, I think we have to help them to. I mean, at a most basic level, it drives me crazy sometimes when I hear about what the courses are. I mean, the people who are coming to you in college are uncatechized. So if you start teaching them about the Trinity and how that flows from this, that, and the other thing, you're not gonna touch their lives. I mean, I realize that theology and catechesis are different things, but if you want to evangelize, evangelize. If you want to teach philosophy. You have to make a choice as to which it is you're going to do. And I mean, our young people simply are not well informed of what faith calls them to, and the beauty of it. All they've heard is, remember, Pope Benedict said, "The church is not the church of no, the church is the church of yes." And he also founded that office of new evangelization. That's his. He put Archbishop Fisichella in there, and he saw that as, But evangelization and catechesis are one thing. Speculative theology and philosophy are something else, and that so for I think we have to approach uh, our college students by making sure there's a worship life available for them, and that worship life is rich. We encourage them to participate in it, because you can't be a Christian if you have an opportunity as a Catholic. You can't be a Catholic without the Eucharist, and I think that's key to helping them to. That's why we have the Newman Center at Orono and try to make sure that the young people have an opportunity to gather in community and to be nourished by the Eucharist. Because we can't do this on our own, and we don't do it by just passing on information. We have to do it by invoking the Holy Spirit and by bringing the young people into contact with the Christ, in order that they might be touched by the love He brings us, so that they can touch each other with that love. So I think that's. I mean, how you do that? I think you listen to their questions. It's hard. It's hard being a young person in the world today and have a system of values which would be considered Christian values. It's difficult because the culture is very much against you, and becoming even more rapidly against you as time goes on. So I think it's important that Catholic institutions realize that they are Catholic institutions and they have a certain uh, reality that they hold, and they should be upholding that and helping young people, particularly educational systems, helping young people. I mean, it's the same answer I gave to the high school principal: go to mass and bring them with you, and and bring them in touch with Jesus. Reflect on the gospel of the day. Do things that make it possible for them to have an appreciation of their faith in an adult way.
Thanks, Jake. Jake mentioned, oh, Lisa, go ahead. Why don't you go ahead and ask your question.
Okay.
Heidi, you
I
have
just
your hand up.
wanted to comment on Bishop. You had mentioned, Pope Benedict in the regard of how he taught love. That's, I think, one of his fundamental aspects of the new evangelization, this apologetics of love. And then the other was getting back in touch with the ultimate questions. Reminding people of their origin and destiny.
Yeah.
And I think that's what, in regards to his letter on, setting up the whole office, he speaks of that so beautifully. So I'm so thrilled that you brought up that aspect of love as central.
Oh yeah.
So thank you.
Absolutely. In Caritas Veritate, he talks about the different levels of love and all the rest of that. I mean, it's the center of our faith. And in preaching yesterday, I was talking about. I mean, that's what the story of Lazarus is about. Jesus wept. Those wonderful words of the gospel. He was very much in love with that family, and the death of Lazarus affected him. But I mean, fundamentally, what that story tells us is that once we're baptized, we live in God's love. So we're already in eternal life, because what is it to be in eternal life but to be in God's love. So if we are already in it, we just have to realize it as we live our lives, that we live those lives touched by God's love and called to bring it to others.
I want to, just a little time we have left here. Jake mentioned the name Benedict. Each pope is purposeful in choosing their name. And can you share with us a little bit about what either maybe he shared with you or just what you came to understand why it is he chose Benedict? How was that part of how he understood his role as pope?
I think Jake has it. I mean, I think that he understood Benedict as bringing a whole new reality to the culture, to Western culture. I mean, the post-Roman Empire world of Europe is referred to often as the Dark Ages, but it was not dark. It was imbued with the monasticism of Benedict and the Irish monks and all the rest of that. And Benedict, of course, is the first the founder of much of Western monasticism. So I think that he was inspired by that too, because so Benedict is the evangelizer of the Western world after the collapse of after the I guess we don't say that it collapsed anymore. It just kind of evanesced out into different cultures and so on. So, but I think that's an important part of why he chose it. Why he chose Benedict.
That's right. He's the patron of Europe, or the main patron of Europe. So that makes sense. Any other question? One final question for the bishop before we close our time together tonight. Yes, Tyler.
Bishop, what of Pope Benedict's many books is your favorite?
Oh, what is my favorite?
What is your
Oh,
favorite
thank you,
book?
Tyler. The most important thing I wanted to say, the 3 book, Jesus of Nazareth. I think that is, for that is an insight into who Benedict is beyond the theology and everything else, because there he reflects on Jesus, and there he taught, in those 3 books, one Jesus of Nazareth, and then the Holy Week book, and then the infancy narratives. There, I think, that's the end of his life. Those are the summation of who he is, and they're an absolutely patristic reflection on the Gospels. It is a spectacular work, and so thank you for asking that question, because I very much think that those are pivotal in understanding him and seeing them at the end of it. Those are the last things that he really did as Pope, and this is a fabulous work. I mine them all the time for ideas and just for my own prayer.
I heartily agree. They're I think a model of theological generosity. Also, they're accessible. They're deeply reflective, and they're and dialogic. So they're a model of how to have conversation as a theologian with other perspectives. I think absolutely
deep scholarship in them. Where he goes back and forth with different thinkers and so on. But then the prayerful conclusion is what he comes to, which is just wonderful stuff. Wonderful.
And I think a book recommendation is a very good note to end on. So I want to thank all of you for joining us here tonight. And I want to thank you, Bishop, again, for making time available to us. Deeply appreciate your time and your reflections.
It was a wonderful evening, and I really am grateful to all of you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Chris. Take care.